sort of town hall event um, that we've had over the last 9-ish months, just to get some public engagement in our planning process around creating a sort of a countywide vision for conservation. Um, and so maybe this is you've come to every event thus far. Maybe this is your first one, but we're so happy to have you and glad there are so many people who are passionate about conservation in the county coming out tonight and joining us virtually. My name's Sam Calhoun. I'm the Conservation Programs Manager at CLC, and I've been sort of leading this work with other staff and board members at CLC, as well as with Geeta and Jennifer, who are here from Thread Collective, and our sort of mapping GIS consultant, Rick from Upstate GIS, who's unfortunately unable to attend tonight. And so just to sort of set the stage for what we're going to do, when we had originally planned this meeting, we were not anticipating such a large turnout. We had over 200 folks registered. So rather than being a little bit more interactive, which is kind of how we've set up the first three public engagements, we're going to do a little bit more of a informational presentation, and then we can get into some questions and answers about sort of what we're going to talk about tonight. And then briefly, we can chat about next steps and where this plan is going towards the end. So just a note here, please, as we move through the presentation, feel free to use the chat to put your questions in, sort of when they come to you. We'll be monitoring that and having sort of a moderated Q&A that Jennifer will lead at the end. And then if there's time or if there's desire, we can have folks come off mute, tasks with specific questions or discuss things in a little bit more detail. As well as questions if you want to, provide input at any point on, the maps that we're going to look at, the recommendations that we're going to talk about tonight, or sort of process next steps. Please feel free. We can take the chat sort of offline and look at it for your feedback as well. So anything and everything is welcome in the chat. So please feel free to use it. Yeah, I think that's kind of my housekeeping, and then I'll turn it over to Geeta.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for spending your Wednesday evening with us. This is a really exciting moment where we are sort of nearing the end of the plan to conserve Columbia County. And as Sam said, a 9-month process of sort of research and mapping and understanding all of the unique characters of Columbia County to really understand how to conserve them and strategically think about this for the future. All of you are probably residents of Columbia County, so I know I'm speaking to all those who already love the landscape and the environment, but sort of I'm going to do a little bit of a preamble before we get to the deep mapping, so that way we're sort of all on the same page in terms of understanding the process, what got us here, and where we're going. So, Columbia County is an incredibly unique ecological system. It sits at a very interesting place in terms of being sort of in this north of more urban areas, south of more rural conditions. It sits with the mountain range to the west, to the east with the Taconics and the Hudson River to the east, to the west. Oh my God, everything's backwards today. And so, understanding these unique characters of Columbia County really have played an incredibly important role. And Columbia County, has a fairly low dense population. We've been looking at a number of sort of statistics in terms of influencing the plan, 17 National Historic Sites, 68,000 acres are already conserved by CLC, with 20% of the county's land area used for agriculture. So a lot of these aspects really make it an important location within the context of conservation, which is why it's really important to be doing what we're doing today. just so we all sort of understand what a conservation plan is. It's a vision to protect, preserve, manage, and restore landscapes for people, wildlife, and habitats. The plan combines available scientific data, mapping analysis, and public input to identify strategic conservation priorities for Columbia County's natural spaces and working lands. And, who is the conservation plan for? This is helping CLC really strategically think proactively in the future around the conservation of land. So not just being reactive, but really thinking strategically and helping to create sort of some of the decision making, both in the planning process and in the decision making process. But it in no way dictates the specificity of that. There's a lot of other processes that need to happen along with that. And the plan will create and document important natural resources, and it will be used both by municipalities, CLC, it'll be made public, in addition to allowing residents to have access to this information and help them guide their own decisions on private parcels. So sort of a little bit of the history of preservation or conservation in Columbia County. This is an early map from 2004 showing close to 15,000 acres, or just a little over 15,000 acres of conservation in over a little bit more than a decade. Now we're at about 30,000 acres. So that's quite a lot of conservation growth, in no small part thanks to CLC's efforts. And this map, we're showing both easements, public property, and CLC's parcels as well. And so you can see in this graph the growth from, sort of the very beginning of CLC to today, going from, sort of less than 5,000 acres all the way to above 30,000 acres. And so the next sort of stage is really thinking about how do we even further increase this conservation strategy, but how do we do it in a way that is in alignment or in an understanding of the considerations of natural resources and what the strategic requirements are for sort of making a better strategic conservation plan. So what was the process for creating this plan? We went through a series of engagements, public meetings, just like this one, and we hosted, this is our fourth public meeting, in addition to doing a really robust survey and having an advisory group that helped to steer both the ideas, the methodology, the mapping, and then having CLC staff be really closely involved as well in review processes throughout. So the public meetings were really, really important. There were 3 of them held. 2 have been on Zoom, including this one. 2 were in person, sort of poring over maps. This was a way that we could really understand in detail the sort of nitty-gritty of various different parcels and communities, municipality needs. We recorded everybody's thoughts and comments, and they really informed the way that we delineated the priority areas and informed the recommendations and the key considerations that have come out of this. And so during this process, as I said, sort of we very early on gathered resources, NRI data, and a myriad of other data sets that you'll see. The community input process was absolutely key. And then we have been able to identify and prioritize the ecological systems that are a part of the conservation. And as you'll see, there's a weighting and a scoring system that helps us understand locally and regionally which different areas of Columbia County sort of have higher rankings than other areas, that are just a guiding point to understanding conservation. And the recommendations, as you'll see, we'll reveal some of those recommendations. And they're in an iterative process. They're informed by the general public, and we hope that you'll give us some feedback on those as well. And in the future, we hope that there's some monitoring around the implementation to really understand the success of the plan. And the plan is meant to be, a guide and is live, right? And so it's not something that's set in stone, but it's a way to understand and read the landscape. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to talk about the survey.
Okay. Geeta, I didn't have me on quite yet until the 30 by 30, but I'm happy to jump in if you'd like.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so we received 458 survey results from across the county. And you can see here some of the high level feedback. There was an opportunity for folks to put their personal thoughts in there in addition to answering specific questions. So this list kind of references some of those write-ins that people shared with us, and things that really came to the fore were things like public access, connectivity, both for wildlife as well as for people, agriculture, and the important role of agriculture also came to the fore. Equity and access, and you'll hear more about that later in the presentation. The threat of development. Again, you'll hear a little bit more about that later in this program. But overall, people were very supportive of all kinds of conservation, and want to get involved, I would say was also one of the takeaways from that. And Geeta, if you go to the next slide. Here you can see the actual questions that we asked about during the survey and how folks rated them. So the opportunities were between 1 and 5, with 5 being the most important. And protecting water was rated as the highest priority in the survey. A lot of agreement that that is a very high priority for Columbia County, and the survey average rating came in at 4.9, again, the highest. As you'll see, there's not a huge difference between the numbers. Everything was rated pretty highly. But I think that speaks to the fact that, again, folks really believe in the value of conservation in Columbia County and the value of protecting for different kinds of resources. Protecting forests came in at 4.8, and supporting native plants and animals, biodiversity, habitat protection, et cetera, came in at 4.7. Next slide. Climate resiliency was next in line at 4.6. And that was, there's obviously that encompasses a lot of pieces: climate adaptation, species movement, et cetera. And protecting farmland, while the lowest at 4.5, was still highly rated by respondents. Again, everything was rated as important, which was support for the work that Columbia Land Conservancy is already doing. There was also a question about public access. You can see on the slide, how important is public access to conserved lands? And 86% of survey respondents said that public access to conserved lands is extremely important or very important. So again, a very important value in thinking about future conservation lands in the county. Why are we doing the conservation plan now? Well, of course, threats to the health of nature and the land and and because it's helpful to have a roadmap, but also because it fits in with the global initiative known as 30 by 30. Folks may have heard of that. It's a proposal from scientists in response to habitat destruction, climate change, and other threats to biodiversity. And the proposal is to protect 30% of Earth's lands and waters by the year 2030. And more than 190 countries have already signed on, including the United States under Joe Biden's presidency. And at least 9 states have established 30 by 30 goals, and that includes the state of New York. And actually, Gita, if you don't mind going back to the previous slide, CLC set an aspirational goal of 30% of Columbia County protected by the year 2035, and sort of based on where we are now. And where are we now? As you can see, currently 16.7% of the county, so a little more than halfway. So this goal is visionary, and there's a ways to go, but the conservation plan can help us move toward it. And also, because it is aspirational, it will take the work of not only Columbia Land Conservancy, but New York State and other organizations as well. So, and if you look at this graph here, this shows the percent of each town that's conserved, and you can see it's not equal across the towns, as might be expected. It ranges from approximately 7% to over 40%. That's okay, but it shows where things stand now, helps and allows towns to assess how they fit in with the rest of the county as a whole. Okay, next slide. And as mentioned, New York State has committed to the 30 by 30 initiative. It adopted its draft strategies and methodology last year in 2024. And that does include collecting data and collaborating with nonprofits, including supporting conservation partners. So there is the potential for funding opportunities to implement some of the conservation projects that would advance the 30 by 30 goal.
Great.
And come out of the plan. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And so with that, we're going to go into the mapping of the priority areas. And so the information from our survey, the research, understanding the goals of the project have led us to identify 5 priority areas. The first being water, and water includes stream corridors, riparian areas, floodplains, wetlands, and aquifers, amongst other watery landscapes. And then ecological resources, which is a fairly broad category. And this includes forests, habitat, biodiversity, endangered species, and sort of that broad natural resources category. Farmland, which is soils and agriculture, climate resilience, which includes, as we said, climate corridors, carbon storage, sea level rise, and understanding the resilience aspects of a variety of different ecosystems. And then public access is our 5th priority area, which includes access to trails, open space, environmental justice communities, and understanding the situation of parks within the public access. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk about the data sets and the mapping.
Thanks, Gita. Yeah, so kind of building off of the priority areas that we had identified through sort of the early planning stages of this project, we collected a ton of data, and that's really kind of at the heart of this plan is collecting and analyzing the data that's available to us about the natural resources across the county. So I'm not going to read this list or even come close, but this is just to illustrate just some of the data sets that we were able to access when putting together the prioritization model, which produced the maps that we're about to show you. So, some of this made it into the priority model and some of it did not, but that's not to say, we can't consider it later on. It's still sort of an inventory of data for us to be able to consider as we approach different projects or evaluate individual properties. So, just wanted to give that sort of disclaimer about how we thought about including data in the prioritization model and why some of it has been excluded. Um, so this first map is what we call our overall scoring map. And this is a combination of the priority maps for each of the 5 priority areas. And so this map is going to look a little bit confusing at first. And I think will sort of become more clear as we move through each category in terms of why it looks the way it looks. Look at this map and understand it is to consider it almost like a heat map.
Oops.
And so when we took the priority model, we're stacking all of this data on top of each other. And this map, I think, the easiest way to explain it is where do the overlaps exist of the most resources that we considered in the prioritization. So I'm going to leave that here for now. And of course, if folks have questions about the overall map and how it translates to the individual resource maps, we can come back to that in the Q&A. But just wanted to introduce, this is sort of the aggregation of all of the other maps that we're about to look at. Next slide. And so before we move on, just looking at sort of the high level areas of shading. So I should have mentioned when you look at this map and you look at sort of that heat map idea, you might notice in the key that the darker the shading is, sort of the higher the priority level we're setting for it. So again, stacking all those resources up where it's the most overlap. And so you can kind of look at it visually and see for yourself where are those dark areas around the county. And so, you might notice, some of the outlets along the Hudson River of the major streams in the county. Those are often surrounded by wetlands or, flood plains that might be important for protection. You notice, some of these big dark areas along the Taconic Mountain Ridge that we share with Berkshire County to the east. And so in places like New Lebanon and Canaan, in Austerlitz near Beebe Hill State Forest and Harvey Mountain, and as well down in Copake near Taconic State Park and CLC's own Over Mountain Conservation Area. So, in addition to that, you can pick out some other sites that you might be familiar with around the county, like Hand Hollow State Forest. Um, this sort of bigger area west of the Taconics in Copake, where we see things like wetlands and farmland and connected forests and resilient landscapes all sort of stack on one another. So those are just to sort of draw your eye to the kind of mapping that we've done. And so the rest of the maps parallel this map in their design and in how you might read them. So let's kind of dive into those. And then I think if folks want to come back to the overall map at the end, I'm happy to answer more questions. But I think giving a little bit more context for this map is helpful. Next slide, please, Gita. Thank you. Okay, so we'll start with the first category, and that was water. And so on the left, you'll see sort of a list of the data that we considered in our prioritization model and what we scored. And so I won't go through all of those, but it includes things like, streams, wetlands, aquifers, flood prone areas, um, stream habitats that might be important for aquatic, um, organisms or like trout spawning streams, things like that, that all sort of make up the aquatic resources of the county. And so when we scored them and then applied the same sort of heat map methodology here, you can see, where the darker areas of the county show up. And so it maybe is or maybe is not sort of clear where some of the streams are. If we want to go to the next slide, Gita, I think we can pull out a couple of them.
Oh,
These darker
sorry.
streams that are often surrounded by wetlands or have important sort of riparian buffer zones around them. So in New Lebanon, the Wyoming Creek. In Kinderhook, you can see in that bubble around 9H, the Kinderhook Creek and the Glacier that ultimately ends up flowing into the Hudson. In Taconic, you have the Taconic Creek and the Taconic headwaters, which contributes to the drinking water for the city of Hudson, and the tributaries there is sort of a darker area. Down in Ankrum, you have this area of a lot of overlapping water resources with um, sort of a combination of DEC wetlands, important habitats, some resilient floodplains and wetlands that are relatively well connected. And then, of course, there's the Rojan and some other of the sort of signature streams that you might, be familiar with around the county. And so those are sort of what's mapping highly. Um, and then if you want to go to the next slide, Gita, and take the recommendations.
Yeah, so here we have what we call the water resources map. And so for each of these priority areas, we have a sort of complementing resources map that just helps to really understand the resources themselves in relationship to the prioritization. So in the report, when we send this to the public, you'll be able to see those side by side. But all of these sort of scoring methodologies have led us to understand sort of some, key recommendations. They're pretty high level at the moment. And so obviously, sort of with most of these resources, prioritizing the protection of these waterways and water bodies that we have identified as the highest ranking is pretty key. And then, there are going to be a number of methodologies to be able to prioritize those at the municipal level and at the county level. We want to ensure that riparian protection is included in conservation projects. And that can be through easements, through riparian zone restrictions, ensuring that there is an adoption or a promotion of management techniques that reduce nutrient and sediment loads. We want to ensure that our water bodies are kept clean, sort of now and in the future, depending on where future development happens. In addition, ensuring that vernal pools are protected along with other vulnerable types of ecosystems or water-based ecosystems like forested wetlands and hydrological connections that are not legislated by the federal and state jurisdictions, that we have local laws that cover those. And then, key aquifer recharge zones. Those we want to limit impervious cover and industrial pollutant source points around those areas, and have that be a part of our planning process. And so that concludes the water section. And we will move on to the next key priority area, which is ecological resources.
Great. Yeah. So this should start to maybe feel like a pattern in terms of the visual representation on the map. But the next category, the ecological resources, are really focused on, not the aquatic resources, but the terrestrial resources across the county. So, things like forests, rare and endangered species, important terrestrial habitats that have been identified. And so you can see the scorecard on the left here. And when we take a little bit closer look at the map, you might start to notice kind of right away that the eastern section of the county is much darker than the western portion. And as you can sort of maybe imagine in your mind, and we can look at on the resource map, that is the section of the county that is primarily forested. And so, some of that coloration is due to these big connected forest blocks that run across the county. And up into the Berkshires, up into New Hampshire, up into Vermont. So, and then down also into the Appalachians. And it's an important sort of corridor that really, is illuminated on this map. So we can also look at some more specific areas and examples. Gita, if you would go to the next slide, please. So, quickly before focusing on that eastern section, we should also mention, you know, just because that portion of the county is kind of lighting up as very important does not mean that there aren't really important ecological sites on the western portion as well. So earlier we were talking about some of those important stream outlets and areas around the Hudson River that might contain unique habitats. Um, and might be worthy of further protection. Um, Other sections include sort of the areas along the Taconics, like we've been talking a lot about. So through New Lebanon, Canaan, Austerlitz, Hillsdale, you see that large coloring of highest priority lands. And then also there's this corridor in the southern portion of the county that runs sort of north through Gallatin, Taconic, and Copake to connect into the Taconic Mountains. So that's sort of the foothills, and that's made up of some large intact forests that provide a lot of connectivity for wildlife and species movement. So a lot of the highest priority scoring, unsurprisingly, is sort of driven by the high quality forests and the forest connectivity that we do have in the county. And so you're sort of seeing that reflected here on the map, given the shading. And we can go to the next slide, Gita. And just quickly, just to sort of focus in a little bit more on forest, because it is kind of a large or sort of dominant lands across the landscape here in the county. Columbia County, just for context, sits within this Mid-Hudson Forest corridor, which you see on the map on the left. Might be a little bit hard to see at this scale, but basically it's a area of connected forest that's been identified that runs across Columbia County into Berkshire County south as well, that is key to preserving the ability of wildlife to move across the landscape. And so that's sort of like the macro version of connectivity, just to sort of contextualize it regionally. And then if we look at this map on the right, it sort of echoes the coloration that we see on the priority maps, but we did not actually score this. This is data that comes to us from UMass Amherst analyzing forest connections across the Northeast. And so, but similarly to the prioritization maps, the coloring is sort of telling the story here. So the darker the coloring, the more sort of connected that landscape is. And so you can see these ribbons running, west to east, or east to west, depending on how you look at it, across the county. And those are really those key linkages. Also on this map, that's probably a little bit more difficult to see is these larger forest patches that have been identified across Columbia County and really throughout the entire Hudson River estuary. So the sort of entire Hudson River region, and you'll have an opportunity to look at this map a little bit closer when the plan is ready. But one notable feature that Columbia County has is just a large concentration of these highly scored, highly uh, rated or in good condition forest patches that make up that forest corridor. So just emphasizing that forests and forest connectivity really are driving sort of the ecological resources on this map because we are focused on terrestrial species and data. And then yeah, we can go into the resource slide as well.
Great. So another sort of map here that looks at the ecological resources to complement the scorecard or scoring map, and looking at the recommendations, once again, sort of thinking about prioritizing the protection of these large intact forest blocks that Sam just mentioned. And it's a really wonderful thing to have them. And so we want to sort of conserve and preserve them, and understanding how we can do that both within the planning processes that we can implement. And then really prioritizing these linkages. Connectivity came up in both the surveys and in our one-on-one talks and sort of in-person discussions that sort of connectivity is a really, really important feature to really be a part of the conservation plan. And thinking about these long-term forest stewardship models, integrating in community participation, and really understanding how we as residents in Columbia County can sort of steward and take on these forest plans, both at the municipal level and even at the parcel level. Yeah, and providing guidance and support for landowners. Part of the plan is to be an educational model as well. And then encouraging sort of sustainable forestry practices, and assessing climate risks through the analysis of flood-prone areas, drought risk, and heat impacts as a part of the sort of ecological systems that are at play. And with that, we will move on to our next priority area, which is farmland resources.
Great. Thanks, Gita. Yeah, so number 3, farmland. Again, you see the similarly shaded map here. This one is a little bit different because farmland is so sort of parcel based. So a lot of the data that's available to us is about individual properties, but not all. So the drivers of this category were really, intensity of agricultural use. So what proportion of the property is being used for agriculture, and actually across the entire county, almost half the parcels in Columbia County have at least some accessory agricultural component on them, meaning that at least a fourth of their area is used for farmland. So again, that's by area, not by number of parcels, but it just does sort of drive the point home that agriculture is a huge part of Columbia County and the culture of Columbia County, and the landscape of Columbia County. And so, in addition to sort of how intensely we use the farmland in our county, we also considered the quality of soils, the adjacency to other farmland and other protected farmland, and whether or not the agricultural land sits within these established county agricultural districts. And so we can go to the next slide, Gita. You know, when you look at that map, obviously there are some concentrations, although there is a pretty nice distribution of important farmland across the county. But in particular, you can look at the southeast, Ankrum and Copake, where we know there's a lot of agricultural activity and came up as ranking very highly. You can also see in the Northwest, particularly in Stuyvesant, Kinderhook, Stockport, another big sort of accumulation of high quality farmlands. I should note too that actually a lot of the farmland in that portion of the county is already protected, so that sort of contributes to the surrounding lands being prioritized for protection as well, trying to create a block of protected lands. And then there's also the sort of this corridor that you might follow just visually that runs sort of it runs northeast, but starts in the southern half of the county through Germantown, Livingston, Claverack into sort of southern Ghent, another sort of area of the county that's sort of heavily used for agriculture currently and does have these high quality soils and ranks highly as well. So you know, the entire county is really home to a lot of high quality agricultural lands, and so it's not surprising to see this sort of nice spread across the county.
Great. And so how can we uh, look to conserving farmland in terms of the recommendations that we're providing? We have a sort of series here. Work with farmers and municipalities to increase rate of farmland protection via easements and acquisition on the county's most important farmlands, and that map will help us sort of create some priorities around that. Compensation for landowners for preserving farmland is really important. Maintaining and renewing county-wide agricultural districts and designations of those agricultural districts, adopting the right to farm local laws. There's a more statewide law that exists. Ensure future agricultural conservation easements, and that they should consider local food system services, farm economics, agritourism, and value-added products, opportunities for farms to provide synergistic programming to further support economic development, to help their economic vitality, and then just ensuring that there's an affordability to the models. Great. And with that, we will move on to our next priority area, which is climate scoring.
Thanks, Gita. Yeah, sorry if it feels like a whirlwind, but got to try to get this information out so we can answer questions. So the fourth priority area is climate, and really this is focused on climate resilient landscapes and less so on sort of the human impact of climate change, although we recognize, those implications are equally worthy of consideration, but are often a little bit more local, and so kind of fell outside of the context of this planning process. But the data that we see here, and again, you'll see the same shading. A lot of it comes from a data set put together by the Nature Conservancy, which mapped resilient areas, important corridors for climate in the similar vein as the connected landscapes and connected forests that we have in the county. We also looked at some of the predicted sea level rise, basically where are there wetlands now? Where might there be wetlands given a changing climate in the future? And where are those areas that we might want to preempt and protect in advance? And so this data was done, and this evaluation was done across the entire Northeast. And so it's sort of notable, but about 12% of Columbia County is considered above average for resiliency. So it is sort of regionally significant, and you can see the areas that kind of are hotspots, so to speak. And so if we take a closer look, so it might be becoming more clear where the important areas are as we look at more of these maps. But first, along the Hudson River, these important outlets of streams where there might be risk of flooding in the future as the climate warms. We also can see on the eastern portion of the county the hotspots along the Taconic Ridge and in the Taconic Mountains, and as well as sort of those foothills leading up across Hillsdale and Copake and in Austerlitz. And then there's also sort of this interesting pocket of highly resilient and diverse land in Gallatin, and that runs kind of into Taconic, near Taconic State Park, or Lake Taconic State Park, excuse me. And so in that area, and particularly, the confluence of sort of this climate corridor that we've been speaking about, and also some of these confirmed resilient sites that do have sort of confirmed biodiversity qualities, as well as contain portions of like a resilient watershed. So, that's when we get the hotspot, is when we get the stacking of those values. And so, that one is just kind of like an interesting blip in the middle that we maybe weren't anticipating. And so it's a good example of, actually looking at this analysis can uncover some interesting findings. Um, so yeah, I'll just keep it brief given the time already, so we can move on to the recommendations, Gita.
Gita, you're muted.
Either you're muted.
Sorry about that. Recommendations, prioritizing the highest priority areas that Sam just mentioned within our planning processes, and then thinking about how to reestablish and restore some of the resilient native landscapes that are really important in this aspect in terms of meadows, forests, wetland ecosystems on both municipal and on private lands, and assessing the human impacts of climate, uh, such as impacts on flooding, drought risk, and heat impacts, recognizing the importance of forests and other native habitats as carbon sinks, and then recognizing the importance of connecting landscapes at all levels for species movement and migration. And so those are just the beginning of our high-level recommendations. We'll dive more into that into the plan. And with that, we will move on to our last priority area, which is public access.
Thanks, Gita. Yeah, last but certainly not least, given the overwhelming support we saw for public access in the survey, um, we looked at opportunities to expand and create new areas that folks can, access for recreation. Um, so in this map, it looks a little bit different than other maps because it is largely based on sort of two factors. One, where can we expand already publicly accessible land? And sort of the inverse of that question, where are the places in the county where there's a lot of people, but there is not a lot of publicly accessible land? And so to create this map, we considered sort of adjacency to already existing protected lands that is open to the public, and then right sort of the null space where are the gaps, and so we can go to the next slide, Gita. We zoom in a little bit. Um, I want to call our attention to these three sort of bigger orange blobs that you might notice on the maps. And so these are actually mapped communities where there's a population density, but a lack of access to public areas for recreation. And so, sort of that northern, northwestern Chatham, Niagara Kinderhook area, this area down here outside the city of Hudson and in Greenport, and then as well, um, in this corner of Copake where you both have a population density, but you also have existing public lands that could be expanded to make it more accessible to folks living in that area. So, I think a lot of us know some of the state parks around the county, Beebe Hill State Forest and Harvey Mountain. Hand Hollow comes up as another sort of key area to focus on expanding. And then, for creation of new sites, we might look at some of these areas that have limited access at this point. And so, CLC is already focused on, sort of expanding access to nature around the city of Hudson. But there might be some additional places around the county where we would focus some future efforts in terms of opening sites or partnering with, other organization or state parks to do that. So, those are just some of the key highlights. And of course, when I'm calling out all of these areas, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to illustrate sort of the takeaways here. So, next slide, Gita.
Great. And so once again, prioritizing and increasing the amount of land in Cumberland County that is publicly accessible, really important aspect of conservation. And this can be in terms of acreage. Its equitable distribution is also really important across the county. And then the diversity of types of land, from forest and river access, water, farmland, et cetera. And then increasing acreage of publicly accessible lands that are adjacent to protected lands, just as Sam said. Those are recommendations for both municipalities and at the county level as we look to the planning process. And so with that, we are concluding the priority areas. But we want to ensure that there were a few key considerations that run in parallel with those mapped areas the priority areas that we have been looking at and did a deep dive on. And that's because these came up during both the survey and our research. And it was really important to understand conservation in relationship to three other key considerations. And so one of them being energy. And so within the report, these will be expanded upon. And here we just have a sort of condensed information. So that way we leave you with an understanding that, sort of where the human impact is in terms of conservation. So energy is really an important aspect as growing energy independence is really important, and understanding a low carbon future. And so there are some recommendations here that we're looking at in terms of how do we start to really look at agrivoltaics as an option and energy overlay zoning. How do we ensure that we just have a lower energy future? Looking at planning and legislation with climate action plans, tying emissions reductions to conservation and land protection goals, and encouraging that we and planning for district energy and microgrids as some solutions. And another issue that's come up numerous times and is not just an issue for Columbia County, but is really an issue sort of statewide and really across the nation is housing, but then looking at housing in relationship to conservation. And so how do we ensure that, sort of gentrification isn't a byproduct, and how do we ensure that housing remains both equitable and accessible? So there are a number of different planning methodologies we can recommend in terms of cluster development, looking at the densification and ADUs or accessory dwelling units being incorporated into planning and zoning, ensuring that there's an integration of housing policy with conservation planning, and that we create sort of this model of parking and shared drive design to minimize hard infrastructure that increases the opportunities for conservation, and then allowing zoning setbacks that will allow an increase for density, but yet allow for open space. And then the third issue that's also really, really critical, and it plays really a role throughout the plan for conservation is equity, and just acknowledging that there are equitable issues that need to be addressed at all levels. There are a number of different recommendations that we're looking at. Sort of understanding traditional ecological knowledge is incorporated into stewardship and land and water management practices, and respecting those kinds of practices. expanding public access. So we mentioned that before. Ensuring related to the housing one, ensuring that displacement and green gentrification isn't a negative byproduct, and ensuring that there's affordable housing. And then really looking at the funding model and how can we fund communities and environmental justice communities that are affected by environmental degradation. And so with those three, that sort of concludes the sort of parts of the scoring and the mapping and the bulk of the conservation plan itself. We're sort of here, we're going to end by showing what we're offering the municipal scale. So as a part of the report and a part of the deliverable, we'll be making accessible this information at the municipal level. So within the report, there will be a section that takes these sort of 23 cities, towns, and villages, and some of them are combined to create 19 municipal maps. And these municipal maps will be a series of 4 pages. And this will allow each municipality to have a little bit more of a detailed perspective in terms of how this countywide level of information sort of drills down or is available at the municipal level. So this is just an example. Chatham, being the home of CLC, is where we started. So this isn't new information, and this is not taking the scoring methodology and doing it at the municipal level. This is taking those countywide maps and showing them at a scale that's just easier to read at the municipal level. So it's basically the same information, it's just a little bit more zoomed in. And so there'll be one that is the overall score, there will be the water map, there will be one that's related to farmland, and then one that's related to ecological resources. And so hopefully this can then be available and accessible for municipalities that are going through various different planning methodologies, useful for advocacy, useful for understanding how the scorecard works at the sort of at the more detailed parcel level. And this will be sort of available both online and in the report itself. And with that, that concludes our presentation. There are a number of next steps. And so, part of this process is understanding how we can do a bit more education across the county related to conservation, working with municipalities to understand both the plan and the way that this can be useful for both, sort of planners and residents alike and landowners as well. And then, sort of taking this to the next step for CLC, so that way it becomes part of CLC's strategic planning process. And with that, Sam, I can turn it over to you for any final comments or thoughts.
Sure, yeah. I think we can jump into Q&A. I'm so curious to hear what folks' thoughts are and what their questions are. I did just want to clarify one point just at the beginning of the presentation. I think we had said that CLC had conserved 68,000 acres. That's actually the total across the county. And so that's in collaboration and led also by partners like the Department of Environmental Conservation and state parks and other land trusts like Scenic Hudson, organizations in the county like the Harlem Valley Rail Trail. And so I just wanted to clarify, I wish that CLC was at 68,000 acres because then, we wouldn't need the plan. We'd already done it, but we'd already done double it. But just wanted to clarify that point in case anyone was confused by that. And of course, the portion that CLC has been able to do just over 30,000 in conservation easements and approaching sort of 5,000 acres of lands that we own and manage is, through all of the generous donations of landowners who have donated conservation easements or donated lands, and our donors as well. So just a shout out to them, and just wanted to clarify that point in case folks were wondering. But yeah, happy to move on to questions in the chat if there are some outstanding. Please feel free to uh, flood it with more questions, and we can try to answer as many as we can in the time we have left.
Yeah, there's been a very robust conversation happening in the chat, and many of the questions have been answered. I think there was an early question that I think it'd be important to go back to because it's kind of baseline probably for a lot of people. And that question is, what is CLC's definition of protected? Are you willing to take that on, Sam?
I can try my best. So for us, protected land starts kind of with legally protected land that we conserve with conservation easements, that we own and manage ourselves. And then, of course, there are other organizations and agencies who protect land in similar ways across the county, like I just mentioned, state, other land trusts, other citizen groups. But I think there's room to also consider lands that municipalities own and manages parkland as protected land. So I think, it's there's kind of the CLC definition, there's sort of a broader definition as well. That's off the top of my head the best response I can give.
Great. There's been some discussion of taxes, land taxes, and some of that's been answered. But one question is whether CLC has investigated tax reform to promote ag affordability. I think he's suggesting universal building tax exemption and ending ag property tax abatement. I'm not sure if those are considerations that CLC has been thinking about.
To be just perfectly honest, I'm not familiar with that approach, so I would love to learn more. If whoever asked that question would want to reach out to me, I'd be happy to chat. Yeah.
Great, great. That sounds great. Another really interesting question came from Alex, and I think I can answer that this probably won't be addressed in the plan, but it's an interesting idea of rights of nature initiatives. I think what he's referring to is this idea that certain natural entities like mountains or rivers get recognized as legal entities. I know in the country of Ecuador has done some rights of nature. They've acknowledged that in the country. They're one of the few countries that does acknowledge that. Has CLC given any thought to that concept?
I think it's an idea I've heard about, but I don't. CLC has not actually engaged in sort of exploring the rights of nature opportunities in the county.
Great.
But,
Sounds like an interesting approach. Here's a question about connectivity and plans to create connectedness from public lands into town centers to encourage more people to walk into their communities rather than drive. So a question about public access and connectivity.
Yeah, I think if we look at that public access map again, that is one of the goals of that analysis, is to try to figure out where are the population centers where we could aim to protect land for public access that are actually and part of that data is looking at lands that are within a quarter mile of town centers and population centers. So trying to get at the walkability question, I think that is one of the big challenges across Columbia County is that we are a county that has, only a couple of very dense population centers and not a lot of opportunity for things like public transit. So some of these public areas, to the east are only accessible if you have a car. So again, I think, I may have touched on this, but what, CLC has been looking at a lot lately is looking at Hudson and the city of Hudson and how do we improve connections to already protected land near the city of Hudson. And so one of our public lands is called Greenport. Some of you might be familiar with it, and actually we're actively working on a project to sort of directly tie that conservation area with the city. So making that linkage, encouraging walking to that site, and hopefully increasing access and the number of visitors who can go there each year. Again, we would also be looking at other population centers around the county, most of them smaller than Hudson, obviously, but kind of replicating that model, figuring out where are those places that might be opportunities to create a situation like that.
Yeah, and I would just add, Sam, connecting conservation also to the rails to trails, so that way it's easily both within bikeable sort of limits and also, connecting to the train line, so that way it's once again it's a rail to trail literally. But being able to expand that network is I think an important part of the public access set of recommendations.
Related to that, I think there was a question comment that connectivity is very important, and the idea of considering partnering with urban areas, roadways, and highways to implement small interventions such as street trees, native wildflower seeds along roads, protected bike lanes and sidewalks, et cetera, in order to protect all of those 5 priority areas. So I think that's another good small scale idea that I just wanted to mention. Here's maybe a question that is a little bit easier to answer. Will the GIS data be available to municipalities?
Yes. So I will
Great.
I will add a caveat that some of the data that we considered was privileged data that was given to us by different entities. So we do have some agreements in place and won't be able to share all of it, but the vast majority, I would say, 95, 99% of it is publicly available data, and we can work to get that data in the hands of municipalities. We can also share, lists of data that we know about that a municipality could then approach the owner of that data about using it themselves. So I think largely yes.
Great. There's a sort of comment and question here about well, first, the comment is great job mapping priority resources for conservation. It's a major step forward and a great data source to drive action. Where does the role of active land stewardship fit in here? And goes on to explain that protecting water, forests, et cetera, we need to do active restoration. And he acknowledges, you know, there's lack of native regeneration due to overpopulation of deer, invasive species, climate stressors, et cetera, and notes that it would be interesting to assess the biodiversity and ecological health of the existing conserved land. So really a question about what sort of ecological restoration is needed and how can we provide resources to landowners to help in that department.
Hmm. Yeah, great question. And I think it's probably on a lot of folks' minds. I think, for the purposes of this mapping exercise and this plan, we haven't envisioned making any or a great great detail a list of management approaches, but that's sort of the whole other side of CLC. So we have a relationship with a lot of the protected land in the county, and we have an interest in seeing it be managed, restored in sustainable and more sort of ecologically conscious ways. He mentioned a lot of the pressures that have been, hitting the county, deer pressure, invasive species. CLC is sort of available as a resource to landowners, not just landowners who we might have a conservation easement with or who have donated land, but really are striving to make a push into sort of that education space just to help folks make management decisions about their own lands. And then the other part of it is being a good example and demonstrating management techniques on our public lands. So we've done, you know, endless invasive species removals on the public lands that we own. We recently have completed or put up a deer exclosure experiment. These are ways that we can demonstrate management techniques to landowners and hopefully encourage adoption of those across the county. But yeah, great question.
Great.
Yeah, I would say just a follow up, Sam, is we would provide a list of resources, but not the explicit stewardship models themselves. We'll have a resources section, I think, as a part of the plan and report.
Mhm.
There's a question here. Is CLC monitoring the purchase of large tracts of farmland or leasing of farmland by outside investors or venture capitalists? And is it a concern?
I think, we track pressures on acquisition of farmland in general. I think, uh, if you're familiar with the county or any of CLC's agricultural programs, it is increasingly unaffordable to purchase a farm if you're a farmer in the county. And so we feel that pressure through farmers that we work with who are looking to acquire land and conserve land. And so we've been able to, work on that a little bit through conservation easements that we can sometimes include an additional provision in an easement that limits and restricts resale, and so that we can restrict it to farms that have to be sold to farmers at agricultural value. And so that's one of the tools that we have that can kind of alleviate some of the pressures from outside interests, whether it's, renewable energy developers or farmland investors or, just, people who want a second home or are looking to purchase a farm but aren't farmers themselves. So trying to keep farmland in the county in farmer hands is, one of our focuses.
Great. There's been some discussion, continuing on the farmland and agriculture piece, there's been some discussion about how whether ag land is categorized by farming practices. So sort of whether there's differentiation between organic and say soy or corn that's, farmed with pesticides. And Sam, I think you did respond to that a little bit by noting that you weren't able to represent that data well visually, and it can get tricky when farmers are using organic practices but are not certified. There was another comment about some of the feed crop farmland not supporting biodiversity and whether there's monitoring or any assessment of that. I didn't know if you wanted to just speak to that any further. I know it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the first point, it's hard to represent that data visually, like I mentioned, and just recognizing that, farmers farm in a variety of ways, and they might not always be certified, or they might be doing some sort of combination of practices. And it really does sort of fall outside the scope of what CLC does to be sort of monitoring farming practices. We support agriculture in general, and I think recognize the role that both conventional and organic agriculture has in the county. So, of course, we're supportive of all farmers across that county, and would like to see adoption of conservation practices increase. But yeah, really doesn't fall within the scope of what CLC is trying to do.
Okay, there's another comment and question here. probably the most unecological acreage in the county is the vast area of parking lots off Fairview Avenue. Any ideas about planting trees in pits in the lots and encouraging more permeable surfaces?
Hmm, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, I don't think, CLC hasn't generally taken on a project like that in the past, but I think, if you want to learn how to plant trees, we know how to do that. So we can maybe be a resource in that department.
Great. I think we've covered most of the questions. There's a little bit more about a little bit more discussion about taxes and tax abatement. Someone asks about what about a tax abatement for leaving forested lands as is? Abatements exist for agricultural land, but not for forested lands left fallow or conserved.
Yeah, I think there is the 480A forestry program at the state level that provides tax abatement for forest practices. I'm not familiar with any other sort of programs like that. I don't know if either of you have any thoughts on that, but I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to answer that one so thoroughly.
Let's see. There's a question here. It says, if there's time, can you speak more about Trillium, the Community Land Trust? There was a question in the chat about whether the Community Land Trust model might apply in some way here. And um, I think the community land trusts are often more connected to housing, but I don't know if you want to speak to what Trillium, the community land trust, what you know about it, Sam. I know it's not a project of CLC. It sounds like you're maybe connected to it.
Yeah, so just on the topic of housing and conservation in general, there's been sort of an ongoing conversation across the Hudson Valley about these two seemingly conflicting interests, one development of more housing and the other being conservation of land being sort of at odds with each other. And I think there's a desire both from the community land trust and affordable housing community, but also from more traditional land trusts like CLC to actually find opportunities to collaborate and create projects that um, can sort of co-cite both values. What's if you think about sort of an attractive place to live, you might think about access to open space, and conservation come into play there. Um, and similarly, we've also been able to borrow ideas from the community land trust world around affordability. So, there's this concept of ground lease, and we have a farmland property that just transferred. It was Thompson Finch Farm, is now owned by Steelbow Farm, where we use the concept often used in affordable housing to decouple sort of the land from the value of the improvements on top of it and trying to create an affordable opportunity for a farm buyer. So, CLC owns the land and the farmer owns the infrastructure on top of it, and we lease it back to them for in the long term. The lease term is 99 years. So that's a very brief way to describe that project. Happy to chat with anyone who's interested in it offline, but there has been this sort of back and forth, and we're really excited that Trillium is getting set up in the county and are looking for opportunities to collaborate with them because we do support their goals as well. So,
Great. Here's a question. What are the best ways for municipal level conservation committees to work with other such committees and CLC, I think is the question.
yeah, I mean, in terms of collaborating with CLC, sort of the what's to come, which is, we can kind of wrap up with the next steps maybe here in the last 5 minutes, but we do want to have some more targeted outreach to municipalities and planning boards, conservation advisory committees, climate smart community committees, also at the county level, county government, and really hope to engage at the municipal level folks with this plan so that it can be a tool for them as well. So I think, if you want to reach out to CLC, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to chat. But we do have plans to kind of do that more intentionally with this plan.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, and it is 7:25, so it's about time to start wrapping up. I don't know, Geeta or Sam, if you guys want to share any final comments.
Yeah, I'll just thank everyone for coming and for asking questions and being engaged, and really appreciate you all taking some time on a Wednesday night to do it. This is not the end of our planning process, so we'll be sort of finalizing our plan and getting ready to push it out end of the year, early next. So you'll still be hearing about this from me and from others at CLC, and hopefully hearing a lot more about it. But we're really excited to kind of be nearing the end stages. So yeah, more to come.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. Please do feel free to reach out with additional suggestions or ideas.
And I should say too, so you'll get a recording of the Zoom and a follow-up email, and then you can get my information there as well. So if you have burning follow-up questions, or if you're like me and think of all your questions after the webinar, feel free to reach out.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for participating, everyone. Have a great evening. Are you able to save the chat as well, Sam?
I should have a transcript of the chat in our account. Yep. But
Okay,
let me just
great.
make sure. I'm gonna stop recording.